really pleased to talk about Robert and his poetry. I knew Robert a bit, not tremendously well. We came across each other in the 80s when I was editing poetry at Meanjin and he was editing at Overland, although I had known him before then a little bit. And we would find ourselves at, there were various, Meanjin Overland things, like the annual cricket match and that sort of thing, where Robert and I were both late to those magazines, and there was sort of established Meanjin and Overland crowds, and so we sort of found ourselves standing a little bit to the side and having a chat to each other about what we were doing, and just sort of getting along, I think, and understanding each other and what we're doing. I always liked him a lot, and I was very fond of him, and we had a lot to talk about in terms of poetry as well, both contemporary and historical. Later, I was involved with judging poetry for the Victorian State Premier's Awards, and as it happened, I was on the committee that gave Robert the prize in '92, and given what happened in '93 when he's passed away, looking back on it, I was very pleased that he got that recognition in that year. His poetry is very varied. This book will show just how varied his poetry is. Where the long distance he travels from where he begins to where he ended. His poetry starts off very. It's always very very carefully crafted right from the beginning. There's an early poem in the book called "Girl Singing," which is just about someone listening to a girl singing in laundry, and it's a very tender poem. It's a very simple poem in a way, and it conveys its emotion very directly. Although it's got a couple of hard edges to it as well, which again is characteristic of Robert's poetry, and that carries on throughout his work. I think a kind of disarming combination of both the very insightful and the quite feeling and tender, as well as the quite steely as well. And also there's that sort of growing confidence that he's got with experimenting with form, I think. And that's particularly evident with that near to final book of his, the final book, I guess, Jane Interlinear, which is one of the most innovative works of poetry in Australia, actually. That's certainly how it appeared to me in '92. It's doing quite fascinating things with the poetic form, even while it's also dealing with this sort of arcane historical material from early modern Britain, early modern England, about succession and conflicts between Anglicans and Catholics at that time, and the treacherous, murderous behaviours of the English nobility. So he's interested in those topics. He's also, in the book you'll read, which a very moving poem about the sinking of the Sydney, that Australian warship sunk by the German cormoran, where every single member of that crew didn't survive. None survived. And Robert had a kind of deep kind of understanding of that tragedy, I think, and that comes through very strongly in that poem. But there are lots of other poems as well, poems of landscape, poems of observation often. I think of Robert as the sort of person, those poems of his where he sits there in a cafe or a coffee shop or something, and he just talks about what he sees in people. He's a very, very insightful kind of poet. He's got a lot to say. He's got a lot of subjects to write about, and his poems often have subjects. But he's also a poet who observes the world around him very insightfully, I think. That's an interesting aspect of his writing. They're recognisably Australian landscapes, aren't they? They're recognisably specific places. Often they're named, I think. And his interest there is in, I think, in the human relationship to those landscapes. It's not just in the landscape as some kind of abstract painting that he's just, no, it's about people in a landscape, characters in a landscape, I think. So there are some poems about Aboriginal Australia, for example, and they're part of a understanding of the natural world that's linked to his idea of spirituality. I think that's there right from the beginning, and it's not surprising that he feels a connection to Aboriginal understandings of place and life worlds embedded in place. That's part of his understanding as well. And right from the beginning, his poetry has a kind of, what's the word? It's not a spirituality which is very foregrounded often in his poetry, but it's there and it's recognisable. He's certainly he's not a preacher. He's not, forcing anything down anyone's throat. But he's unafraid to talk about his sense of spirituality, often occasioned by his experience of nature, I think. Makes it sound like a kind of romantic poet, but he's not really that, I don't think. He's too... he doesn't get carried away, I don't think, in the way that romantic poets sometimes might. He's sometimes associated with Bob Adamson and the New Romanticism, and it'd be interesting to sort of draw some lines of comparison there. But he's on a different kind of trajectory, I think, from Adamson, as we know. Adamson's relation to nature goes deeper and deeper into specificities of Hawkesbury and so on, from that slightly earlier New Romantic stage. Whereas Robert's interests in poetry, I think, fan out rather than become more and more focused and closed in like Bob's. And I mean, that's where Bob's poetry gets its power from. But Robert's poetry kind of fans out, I think, in its perceptions towards the end of his in his later writing. And the poems about the Sydney and the sonnets about the bush and the poems about Lady Jane Grey, for example, are a pretty good instance of that kind of variety. So from the beginning, Robert is someone who's interested in the formal possibilities for language and poetry, but one of the great things about his writing, the course of his writing, is just how complex and innovative and developed that kind of experiment with language becomes in his writing. It's not just that he, figures out how to do sonnets, or he figures out how to do couplets or dramatic monologues or one thing. No. There's a constant, much more radical sense of poetic possibilities, I think, and it's not restricted to contemporary ideas of formal innovation at all. It will shift back and forth between early modern and contemporary. He's well aware of what some possibilities are within contemporary poetic innovation, but he's not restricted by that by any means. But he's always a poet. For anyone who's interested in language, he's one of those poets. You don't read Robert just for his subject matter, if that's the word. You're constantly aware of just how wonderful the things he's doing with language and form are. No doubt. The other great attraction of Robert's writing, his poetry, I think, is its depiction, its use of moments. I was thinking of one of his poems about some kids standing on the back of back of a ute on their way to school and it's about an event that we don't really know. It's a mysterious poem, but it's a very affecting, vivid poem about a moment, and you don't forget the moment, even though you don't know exactly what the moment is. You don't forget the moment, nevertheless. The retrieval of time as well in poems like the early modern ones, the Lady Jane Grey, the Sydney tragedy. They're poems that are retrieving. They're acts of retrieval in historical consciousness, and that's something that Robert feels impelled, feels strongly, is part of his what he can offer in poetry. I think is that kind of strong, vivid sense of moments, and particularly moments from the past, that have a lot of resonance in the present. They're not just arbitrary moments from the past. They're often moments with complex human, like the Lady Jane poems, complex human relations and violence and tragedy as well, or they're moments of significant national tragedy, as in the Sydney poems, and but they're characterised by pinpoint ideas of moments, of sharply delineated moments in time. There's not just sort of big washes of history. They're sharply focused snapshots of time, and that's one of the things that Robert is so skilled at writing about.